not using lower half, not being explosive down the mound. These are things that I was told at this age too, because what happens is we grow so much, so fast. I'm sure you're similar to how I was, but we got these big old feet, big old limbs, right? And all we're trying to do is essentially control our bodies, to an extent. And sometimes the pitching delivery itself can be a little chaotic move. So we want to maintain control. And what that does, it forces us to kind of defy the amount of potential energy and acceleration that we can have going down the slope. We're the only overhead athletes that get to utilize a slope in doing so to produce more power. Now, gravity's our friend in this situation, but at this age, 14 years old, there's a lot of instability issues. So when there's instability, our brain does such a good job of protecting our body against harmful threats. And so what it'll do is it'll try to defy the amount of acceleration we get going down, because again, more acceleration requires more stability. It's like if you were to be running on a downhill or running down a mountain, right? There's a required amount of stability for you to maintain your specific speed, or else you'll get way too fast and fall over, bad things happen. What I always kind of encourage, especially at this age, is to start intentionally practicing higher rates of tempo, because what happens is, just screening this process here, is if we get into our initial lift, right? So when that foot comes up, what we would ideally want to see is as the foot comes up, right, reaching that peak of that leg lift, the body would start to somewhat shift towards that desired target, towards the catcher, right? Now, two things. The first thing, as I mentioned, with the instability issues, which is going to defy a lot of this amount, the acceleration potential, it's going to kind of get stuck over the rubber. And then two is this perception of power, right? So when I read the not using the lower half, this is usually a byproduct of what comes from that, is a limited amount of movement going forward, limiting the body's acceleration going down the slope, and more emphasis being put in the backside. Now, these moves in and of itself aren't necessarily bad. It's just what happens as byproducts of these moves. So when we limit the amount of forward momentum we get upon leg lift, and we put a ton of emphasis with getting our head back over here and putting energy into that ground, again, not bad in of itself, but what could stem from that is the timing of the hips into their rotation. All right, I see it over and over again with younger kids, is the more they spend in the back, right, like over the rubber and getting stuck over the rubber and defying that potential for acceleration, the later their hips start to rotate. Now, I'll break this down for you on why this is so important. It's because it's segmentation, segmenting the two rotations of the delivery, the upper half and the lower half. The lower half, we want to initiate rotation early, probably the center point of the drive phase, right? So right about here is when we would probably start to want to think about rotating those hips. Now, when the lower half rotates, the upper half is going to do what? It's going to stay still, right? Our upper half essentially stays still as our lower half rotates. And this is what creates stretch, separation. To me, it's the biggest component in the delivery because it tackles so many different goals, right? When people talk about how is arm speed created, how is layback created, to me, this is just like what we're talking about, segmentation. So when you segment, you create stretch, but you also create this rotational energy, right, to be captured with your arm. Now, if we don't create, like for this particular instance, since we kind of got stuck over the rubber a little bit and we didn't get so much momentum going forward to trigger, that reaction of, all right, we got to get going, we got to start rotating. Now, when we do come down to our anchor point, right, we're kind of stuck with the throwing shoulder and that rear hip being in that same kind of linear line. Right? And the back foot gives us a pretty good indication of how much the hips are into rotation. So when we limit the amount of stretch that we can get, right? So the disassociation from that throwing shoulder and that rear hip, the hips being late here. So when we limit that, now we're forced to essentially generate independent energy with our arm, right? Because we didn't create a whole lot of rotational energy up until the point in which our front foot anchors into the ground. So now our arm's going to be essentially trying to pick up for lost energy, because that stretch, right, that rotational energy, that torque is what will then pull the trunk through, right, as the front foot comes down, pulls, and then creates arm speed, creates the excess amount of layback, all of that good stuff, not just from the arm independently, but from that rotational energy.
Hey guys, thanks for watching that video. Robby Rowe here. If you are interested in learning more about pitch mechanics, I put together an ebook. I'll provide a link right here for you to click to check it out. Everything I know about pitch mechanics, I put it down on an electronic book. #2023.